During demolition of a Virginia plantation house in 1923, workers discovered something that made authorities seal the site for 3 days. 23 handmade notebooks hidden beneath floorboards throughout the building, each filled with meticulous handwriting, each containing detailed instructions for murder. One notebook was titled simply, "Ways to Die That Look Like God's Will." The man who wrote them had been dead for 60 years, but between 1852 and 1859, 17 plantation owners across 3 Virginia counties died with identical symptoms: violent tremors, blackened tongues, a peculiar sweet smell that physicians couldn't identify. Doctors called it a mysterious fever. The pattern was too precise to be natural. Every death occurred in a household where one man had worked, a man who taught himself to read from a Bible he found in trash, a man who stole medical textbooks and memorized them before dawn, a man who built an underground school in a root cellar while white families slept above. His name was Isaac, 34 years old, African by blood, enslaved by law, genius by nature. There exists a single photograph of him, taken in 1851, a faded daguerreotype that survived against all odds, discovered in a waterproof case behind the same wall where the notebooks were hidden. In the photograph, Isaac stands in his master's library surrounded by floor-to-ceiling shelves filled with leather-bound volumes. He holds a handmade notebook as if it were the most valuable object in the world, because it was. His posture radiates dignity that no chain could break, spine straight, shoulders square, meeting the camera with eyes that seem to pierce through time itself. Light streams from the right through plantation shutters, splitting his face into brightness and shadow. One side illuminated, the other dark. The double life he lived every single day. Look at his hands in that photograph. Dark stains on his fingers. Not dirt. Ink. In Virginia, 1851, an enslaved person caught with ink-stained fingers faced 100 lashes, possible sale to the Deep South where life expectancy was measured in months. But Isaac's hands tell their truth anyway. The notebook he holds contains 15 years of accumulated knowledge, botanical drawings of poisonous plants, maps showing routes to freedom, medical diagrams of human anatomy and vulnerability, encrypted codes designed to pass between enslaved people without detection. This is not a ledger of cotton yields or slave inventories. This is an encyclopedia of revolution. Isaac taught himself to read at 12. By 20, he was stealing medical textbooks from his master's library, memorizing entire chapters, returning them to the shelves before anyone noticed. By 30, he had built something unprecedented, an underground educational system, 19 people learning to read by candlelight in a plantation root cellar. Teaching sessions held while the white family slept above, oblivious to the revolution growing beneath their feet. The photograph itself should not exist. Daguerreotype technology in 1851 was expensive, reserved for wealthy white citizens. Enslaved people were photographed only for auction catalogs, images meant to sell human merchandise. But this photograph is different. Isaac stands meeting the camera's eye with a gaze that seems to look directly at us, at history, at everyone who would eventually see this image. No smile. His face is a carefully constructed mask revealing nothing while suggesting everything. The eyes are intelligent, assessing, dangerous in their clarity. This is not the face of property. This is the face of a man planning something. Behind Isaac's left shoulder in the photograph sits his master's writing desk, an oil lamp, a leather chair. This is where plantation business was conducted, where accounts were kept of human beings bought and sold. Isaac had access to all of it because his owner trusted him, considered him valuable, even exemplary. That trust was Isaac's greatest weapon. 3 weeks after this photograph was taken, Isaac disappeared, vanished during the night like smoke. His master woke to find him gone along with several others Isaac had taught to read. The plantation was searched, slave catchers hired, rewards posted. They found nothing. But 6 months later, the deaths began. Plantation owners across 3 Virginia counties, the symptoms identical, the pattern too precise. The deaths occurred only in households where Isaac had once worked, where he had access to kitchens, medicine cabinets, food preparation, where he could observe, learn, and plan. Modern analysis of the photograph reveals details contemporaries missed. Behind Isaac on the shelf sits a white leather ledger book. In his hands rests a similar-sized handmade volume. The visual parallel is deliberate. Official knowledge versus revolutionary knowledge. The master's records versus the slave's encyclopedia. The 23 notebooks discovered in 1923 contained everything. Detailed instructions for creating poisons from common plants, dosage calculations, symptom timelines, methods of delivery that would avoid detection. Authorities sealed them immediately. They remained classified for 70 years, too dangerous to release, too disturbing to acknowledge, because they proved what the plantation system could never admit, that enslaved people were fully human, fully intelligent, fully capable of systematic resistance. The photograph documents the moment before everything changed. Isaac stands in the master's library holding forbidden knowledge. 30 seconds of absolute stillness required for the daguerreotype exposure. 30 seconds frozen in time. And in that frozen moment, he claimed space in a world designed to erase him. This photograph is all that remains of a man who weaponized knowledge against an empire built on ignorance. The image survived, discovered in that waterproof case along with the notebooks, as if Isaac knew someone would eventually find it, as if he wanted future generations to know he existed, to know what he did, to know that resistance was possible. The man in this photograph taught 19 people to read, created an educational system that continued operating for years after his escape, and quietly, methodically, eliminated 17 slave owners using methods so subtle that doctors never suspected murder. But what we didn't know until the notebooks were finally declassified was this. In the final notebook, on the last page, Isaac left a message written in his precise handwriting. It contained 3 names, 3 plantation owners still alive when he disappeared, men he hadn't reached yet, men who thought they were safe. The message was dated 7 years after the photograph was taken, which means Isaac never stopped. He escaped to freedom and kept working, kept planning, kept hunting. The last name on that list was Senator Clayton Aldrich of Richmond. Aldrich died at his country estate in 1859. Official cause: sudden heart failure while celebrating his re-election. He had been smoking expensive cigars and drinking French brandy to mark his victory. His personal valet, a freedman who had worked for him less than a year, disappeared the same night. The valet's name was never recorded, but in Senator Aldrich's private papers, discovered decades later, there was a single notation in the household ledger. Hired, I. Freeman. Came highly recommended. Excellent with tobacco preparation. Isaac Freeman. I. Freeman. I am free. The photograph captures him before his escape. The notebooks document his methods. But that final entry in Aldrich's ledger proves something even more terrifying. Isaac didn't just escape slavery. He turned himself into a weapon and aimed himself at the heart of the system that created him. This man standing calmly in a library, holding a book, looking at the camera with those intelligent, dangerous eyes. Isaac was 12 years old when he committed his first crime. Not theft, not insubordination, reading. On a humid August morning in 1829, while emptying trash from the main house, he discovered a damaged Bible at the bottom of the pile. The leather cover was water-stained, pages torn and mildewed, rendering it worthless to his master's family who had replaced it with a newer copy. But to Isaac, scanning those ruined pages with hunger he couldn't yet name, it was treasure beyond measure. He hid it beneath loose boards in the quarters where he slept, a cramped space measuring 12 feet by 15, which he shared with 11 other enslaved people, most of them children like him. The quarters smelled of unwashed bodies, wood smoke, and the perpetual dampness that seeped through gaps in the walls. Privacy was impossible. Secrecy required patience and absolute vigilance. Every night after the plantation fell silent, after the oil lamps in the main house were extinguished and his fellow slaves collapsed into exhausted sleep on their cornhusk mattresses, Isaac would carefully extract the Bible from its hiding place. He worked by whatever moonlight filtered through gaps in the wooden walls, teaching himself to recognize letters, then words, then the miraculous patterns that connected them into sentences. The process was agonizingly slow. frustrating beyond anything he'd experienced. No one had taught him the alphabet. No one explained that certain letters made specific sounds, or that those sounds changed depending on their position in a word. He had to decode the entire system through observation and deduction, matching the shapes on the page to words he heard white people speak during the day, building a mental dictionary letter by letter. It took him 6 months of nightly study to read his first complete sentence. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. The moment those words made sense to him, something fundamental shifted in Isaac's understanding of the world. If he could decode these mysterious symbols that white people guarded so jealously, he could access knowledge they tried to keep from him. If he could read, he could learn anything. The limitation wasn't his mind. It was simply access to information. The Bible itself meant little to him spiritually. He cared nothing for its stories of ancient prophets or distant kingdoms. What mattered was what it represented: a key to a locked door, proof that the barrier between ignorance and knowledge was artificial, maintained through violence rather than any natural law. A key to a locked door. By 14, Isaac had memorized every readable passage in that damaged Bible. He needed more. The plantation library became his obsession, a room he was permitted to enter twice weekly for cleaning duties, but never, under any circumstances, to touch the books themselves. The first time he stole a book, his hands shook so badly he nearly dropped it. Gray's Anatomy, a thick medical text with detailed illustrations of human bodies splayed open to reveal their inner workings. He didn't choose it randomly. Isaac had watched the plantation physician, Dr. Whitmore, treat his master's family during their various ailments. He'd observed how certain plant preparations relieved pain, while others induced vomiting or sleep. He'd noticed that white doctors possessed knowledge that gave them power over life and death, made them valuable even to masters who otherwise treated educated people with suspicion. He wanted that knowledge. He wanted that power. The anatomy text revealed human vulnerability in precise clinical detail, where major arteries ran close to the skin, how much blood loss caused unconsciousness versus death, which organs could sustain damage and which, when injured, guaranteed death within hours, where bones were strongest and where they fractured most easily, the specific symptoms of shock, organ failure, internal bleeding. Isaac memorized it all during stolen 3-minute intervals over the course of 2 years. He would wait until his master's family finished breakfast and retired to other parts of the house. He would enter the library with his cleaning supplies, position himself with his back to the door so he could see anyone approaching, open the book to where he'd left off, and read with absolute concentration until he heard footsteps. Then the book would close, slide back into its exact position on the shelf, and Isaac would be polishing furniture when his master entered, never suspecting his property had just absorbed knowledge that could kill him. One Tuesday morning in spring, everything nearly ended. The master's son, Thomas, walked into the library while Isaac was reading. Isaac's hands moved with practiced speed, closing the book, positioning it back on the shelf, pivoting toward the cleaning supplies he'd strategically placed nearby. All in 2 seconds. Thomas barely glanced at him. To white people, enslaved servants were furniture, invisible until needed. That single moment taught Isaac more about his greatest asset than years of careful observation. He wasn't just invisible. He was beneath notice. White people looked through him the way they looked through window glass. They saw what lay beyond, but never the transparent barrier itself. That invisibility became his greatest weapon. He developed a systematic approach to theft. Every Tuesday and Thursday morning, he cleaned the library. During those sessions, he memorized the exact location of every book on every shelf, noting which volumes showed signs of recent use and which gathered dust undisturbed. When his master entertained guests in the evenings, Isaac served drinks and listened with perfect servility, his face blank and attentive. He learned which books were discussed, which were considered valuable, which represented cutting-edge knowledge, and which went unread for months at a time. Those neglected volumes became his curriculum. Medical texts explaining diseases and their treatments, botanical guides cataloging plants both medicinal and toxic, chemistry primers detailing how substances interacted, combined, and transformed, books on pharmacology and toxicology that plantation owners kept for agricultural purposes. never imagining their slave might study them with interests far removed from improving crop yields. Isaac absorbed everything, filing information in his mind with the precision of a librarian organizing shelves. He learned that digitalis extracted from foxglove flowers could stop a heart, that arsenic produced symptoms physicians often mistook for cholera, that certain mushrooms caused organ failure indistinguishable from natural disease, that belladonna in precise doses caused hallucinations and death, while in smaller amounts merely dilated pupils and dried mucous membranes. He learned dosages calculated by body weight, symptom timelines from first exposure to death, methods of delivery through food, drink, skin absorption, inhalation, which poisons acted quickly and which accumulated slowly in tissue, which left traces in corpses and which disappeared, leaving only symptoms that mimicked common illnesses. He compiled this knowledge in his mind like a scholar preparing for examination, creating mental categories, cross-referencing information, testing his memory by reconstructing entire chapters of text from memory during the long hours of field work he was sometimes assigned to during harvest season. The turning point came when Isaac was 16. A woman named Clara, who worked in the kitchen alongside her 2 young daughters, was caught taking leftover food scraps that would have been thrown to pigs. The scraps were meant for her children, who were being slowly starved by reduced rations that the overseer claimed were necessary due to poor harvest, though everyone knew the harvest had been excellent and the rations were reduced simply because he could. The master ordered Clara whipped, 20 lashes. Isaac was forced to watch from the quarters along with every other enslaved person on the plantation. These mandatory viewings served as reminders of what happened to those who disobeyed, who forgot their place, who dared imagine they had rights to anything, even garbage. Clara's screams lasted 15 minutes. The overseer, a cruel man named Patterson who took visible pleasure in his work, administered each lash with deliberate slowness, ensuring maximum pain and maximum fear among the watching crowd. When he finally stopped, Clara lay motionless in the dirt, her back opened in bloody stripes that exposed bone. Isaac helped carry her unconscious body to the quarters. He cleaned her wounds with water and salt, the only medical supplies available to enslaved people. He watched infection set in over the next 3 days, watched her fever rise, watched her die in agony because proper medical care was reserved for property worth more than a kitchen worker who'd committed the crime of feeding her children. He documented everything in his mind with cold precision. Patterson's name, the date, the specific nature of the cruelty, Clara's daughters crying beside their mother's body, the master watching from the porch of the main house, sipping morning tea while a woman died from wounds he'd ordered inflicted. Isaac filed this memory carefully alongside his botanical knowledge and medical learning, understanding with perfect clarity that anger without strategy was pointless. Rage that expressed itself in violence would get him killed or sold, neither of which served his purposes. What he needed was patience, planning, knowledge applied with precision. At 20, Isaac stole his first chemistry textbook. It took 3 months to read because he could only manage pages at a time, and the concepts required deeper understanding than simple memorization. But chemistry explained things botany alone could not: how substances bonded and separated, how compounds formed and broke apart, how materials could be refined and concentrated, how naturally occurring poisons could be purified into forms hundreds of times more potent. The book explained extraction methods using alcohol, water, heat, and pressure. It detailed how to isolate active ingredients from plant matter, how to test concentrations, how to store substances to prevent degradation. Isaac couldn't perform these experiments overtly, but he found ways. When the plantation's rat population became problematic that winter, Isaac volunteered to handle the poisoning. He prepared baits using techniques from the chemistry text, testing different concentrations, observing how quickly rats died, noting symptoms. The rats died. The master praised his ingenuity. Isaac had just conducted his first successful experiments in targeted elimination, refining his methods, learning what worked. At 22, Isaac made his first notebook. The decision carried enormous risk, but memory alone was no longer sufficient for the information he'd accumulated. He needed documentation, organization, reference materials he could consult without relying solely on recall. He stole paper one sheet at a time over 6 months, taking pages from the bottom of stacks in the master's office where their absence wouldn't be noticed immediately. He made ink from crushed charcoal mixed with water and tree sap for binding. He stitched pages together using thread carefully pulled from old clothing, creating crude bindings that would hold. The first notebook was rough work, uneven pages, irregular stitching, but it was his, created entirely through theft and ingenuity, and it represented something white people couldn't imagine their property creating. He titled it Botanical Observations and began systematically documenting poisonous plants native to Virginia. Each entry included botanical name, common name, growing locations and seasons, which parts of the plant were toxic, symptoms of poisoning by dose, lethal dosage calculated by average body weight, and most crucially, how the poisoning could be disguised as natural illness. Water hemlock resembles wild carrot, grows near streams, entire plant toxic but roots most potent, causes violent convulsions and death within hours, easily mistaken for seizures or apoplexy. Foxglove, tall purple flowers, grows in partial shade, leaves contain digitalis, causes irregular heartbeat progressing to cardiac arrest, mimics natural heart failure in elderly victims. Nightshade, small purple flowers, black berries, grows in disturbed soil, entire plant toxic, causes confusion and hallucinations, followed by coma and death, resembles stroke or sudden illness. Isaac tested his theories methodically, first on rats trapped in the barns, then on stray dogs that scavenged around the quarters. He documented results with scientific precision, noting dosages, symptom progression, time until death. Some plants worked too quickly, producing obvious symptoms that would raise suspicion. Others took too long, allowing time for victims to seek treatment or for their bodies to eliminate the poison naturally. He sought the perfect middle ground, substances that acted slowly enough to avoid immediate suspicion but quickly enough to ensure death before effective medical intervention. By age 25, Isaac had filled 5 notebooks hidden in 5 separate locations throughout the plantation. He'd memorized their contents so thoroughly he could recreate them from memory if necessary, but he valued having written records, tangible proof of his intellectual resistance even if no one else would ever see them. But knowledge alone wasn't enough. Information changed nothing unless it could be taught, shared, multiplied through others. Isaac needed a network. The plantation's root cellar became his classroom. The space was carved beneath the kitchen house, accessed through a trapdoor covered by a woven mat used for storing vegetables during winter. Isaac discovered that the main storage area connected to a smaller, hidden chamber, possibly used for storing valuables during some earlier era before his master's family owned the property. That hidden chamber became their school. They met in the hidden chamber beneath the kitchen house every third night, never more than 3 people at once. Isaac had learned from watching his master's business operations that large gatherings drew attention, but small, consistent meetings could continue unnoticed for years. The chamber itself measured 8 feet by 10, with walls of packed earth and a ceiling supported by hand-hewn timber beams that predated the current plantation house. Someone had carved it decades earlier, perhaps centuries, and then forgotten about it or deliberately concealed its existence. Isaac had discovered it by accident during a particularly cold winter when he was helping store root vegetables. A loose board in the main cellar floor revealed steps leading down into darkness. He'd explored it with a stolen candle, finding the space empty except for dust and the skeleton of a small animal that had become trapped and died there. But the emptiness was perfect. No one knew it existed except him, and its location beneath the kitchen meant people came and went from the building above constantly, making unusual foot traffic unremarkable. The first person Isaac brought into the chamber was Sarah. She worked in the kitchen, a woman of 28 with quick hands and a quicker mind, who had watched Isaac for months before he approached her. He'd noticed her observing him, not with suspicion but with curiosity, the way someone studies a puzzle they're trying to solve. One evening after supper service, when the kitchen was empty and the main house had retired for the night, Isaac approached her while she scrubbed cooking pots. "You're wondering how I know things," he said quietly, not as a question but as statement of fact. Sarah's hands didn't stop their work, but her eyes found his. "I'm wondering a lot of things." Can you keep a secret that could get you killed? She set down the pot she was cleaning, dried her hands on her apron, and met his gaze directly. I've been keeping secrets my whole life. What's one more? That night, Isaac taught Sarah the alphabet using a stolen primer he'd hidden in his clothing. He showed her how letters formed words, how words built sentences, how sentences contained ideas that white people tried to keep locked away from enslaved minds. Sarah learned with a hunger that matched Isaac's own. Within 3 months, she could read basic texts. Within 6, she was borrowing books from Isaac's collection and returning them with questions that showed sophisticated understanding. But reading was only the beginning. Isaac taught Sarah which foods could hide bitter tastes, how to prepare hemlock so the poison concentrated in the root became virtually undetectable when mixed with strong spices, how to handle belladonna berries without touching them directly, preventing the poisonous oils from absorbing through her skin, how to time dosages, so symptoms appeared hours after the poisoned meal, making it impossible to trace back to specific food. Sarah absorbed this knowledge with the same methodical precision Isaac employed, understanding without him having to explain that information was only valuable when applied with perfect care. One mistake, one rushed dosage, one moment of emotional reaction rather than calculated planning, and everything would unravel. The second student was Marcus, a stable hand of 32 who could judge a horse's health by its gait and predict weather changes by watching birds. His practical intelligence translated easily into academic learning. Isaac taught him to read using agricultural texts stolen from the library, knowing Marcus would understand the technical language better than poetry or philosophy. But Marcus's real value lay in his knowledge of roots. He traveled with the master on business trips, drove carriages to neighboring plantations, understood the geography of Virginia better than anyone else Isaac knew. He memorized roads, marked safe houses where free black families lived, noted which overseers could be bribed and which were fanatics who would hunt escaped slaves for sport rather than money. Marcus created mental maps that he taught to others, using songs and rhymes to encode information so it could be passed along without paper. The North Star drinks from the dipper's cup. Follow the drinking gourd when the moon comes up. Roots disguised as religious hymns, safe houses hidden in verses about rivers and mountains. Elizabeth was the third, a seamstress of 25 who worked in the main house, creating clothing for the master's family with skills she'd learned from her mother, who had learned from her mother before her. Elizabeth's value to the network wasn't her ability to sew, though that was considerable. It was her access to the master's private papers. While fitting clothes for the master's wife, Elizabeth had access to the family's private quarters. She observed which drawers contained important documents, which desks held correspondence, which locked boxes required keys that hung on hooks in predictable locations. She couldn't read initially, but she could memorize the appearance of documents, describe their seals and signatures, report on conversations overheard while white people forgot she was present. After Isaac taught her to read, Elizabeth became invaluable. She could scan documents during brief moments alone in the family quarters, memorize their contents, report back with precision about business dealings, slave sales, correspondence with other plantation owners about escaped property. The network grew carefully. Daniel, a blacksmith who could forge documents and create tools that appeared innocent but served dangerous purposes. Hannah, who worked in the laundry and had access to every piece of clothing in the household, able to plant or remove items as needed. James, who tended the stables and could sabotage horses so their injuries appeared accidental, preventing pursuit when someone needed to escape. Each person learned to read. Each person absorbed specific knowledge relevant to their position and skills. Each person understood they were part of something larger than individual resistance. Isaac never told them everything. He couldn't risk one person's capture exposing the entire network. Sarah knew about poisons but not about Marcus's roots. Marcus knew about escape paths but not about Elizabeth's access to documents. Elizabeth knew about the master's business but not about Daniel's forgery skills. Only Isaac held all the pieces. Only Isaac understood how each element could combine into systematic resistance. They met in the hidden chamber, always at night, always in small groups, always with escape routes planned if they were discovered. Isaac taught from memory, never bringing his notebooks to these sessions. If someone was caught during a meeting, they couldn't expose written evidence. The lessons followed a pattern. First, literacy. Isaac drilled them on letters and words until they could read basic texts fluently, then specialized knowledge based on their roles. Sarah studied plants and poisons. Marcus studied geography and navigation. Elizabeth studied legal documents and contracts. Daniel studied metalworking and chemistry. But Isaac also taught them something more fundamental. He taught them to observe without being observed, to listen without appearing to listen, to move through white spaces as if invisible while actually seeing everything, to adopt masks of submissiveness while internally cataloging information, noting vulnerabilities, planning how systems could be disrupted or destroyed. He taught them that intelligence was their greatest weapon and patience their strongest defense. That revenge accomplished nothing unless it served a larger purpose. That anger had to be channeled into precise action rather than explosive violence that achieved momentary satisfaction, but guaranteed eventual capture and death. White people believe we're stupid, Isaac told them during one session. They've built their entire system on this belief. Our intelligence threatens everything they've constructed. So we use their assumptions against them. We appear exactly as stupid as they expect, while actually learning everything they try to hide from us. The students absorbed this philosophy, internalizing it until it became second nature. They learned to separate their public performances from their private realities, to code switch between the roles they played for white people and the identities they shared among themselves. By 1851, when that photograph was taken, Isaac's network included 19 people. Not a large number compared to the total enslaved population on the plantation, but carefully selected individuals who occupied strategic positions throughout the household and grounds. Sarah controlled what went into food. Marcus controlled transportation. Elizabeth controlled information flow. Daniel controlled tools and weapons disguised as agricultural implements. Hannah controlled clothing and could plant evidence or remove traces. James controlled horses and could strand pursuers. The others filled similar niches, each person a single piece in a mechanism Isaac had spent years constructing. They didn't call themselves a revolution. They didn't have grandiose names or elaborate plans for armed uprising. They simply existed as a network of informed, educated people who had decided that knowledge itself was resistance, and that the systematic accumulation of power through information would eventually allow them to act when circumstances aligned. Isaac never told them about the 17 plantation owners he would eventually kill. He never explained his long-term strategy. They knew only their individual roles, their specific training, their contribution to something larger than themselves. But they trusted him absolutely, because Isaac had given them something white people insisted they could never have: the ability to read, to think, to understand the systems that enslaved them, and to imagine how those systems might be dismantled piece by piece. 3 weeks after the photograph was taken, Isaac tested his network's capabilities. The master's youngest son, Thomas, had been ill for several days with a stomach complaint. Isaac, in his role as the plantation's unofficial healer, had been asked to prepare remedies. He gave Sarah specific instructions: a tincture of peppermint and ginger for the stomach upset, but also a precisely measured amount of water hemlock extract, diluted to create symptoms that would mimic gastric fever without actually killing the patient. Sarah prepared the mixture exactly as instructed, her hands steady, her expression blank, performing her role perfectly while internally calculating dosages and watching for symptoms. Thomas took the medicine. Within hours, he developed fever, cramping, mild convulsions that alarmed his family but didn't threaten his life. The family physician was summoned. Isaac assisted, playing the role of concerned servant while observing how the doctor examined the patient, what treatments he prescribed, how he diagnosed the illness. The physician concluded it was gastric fever, probably from contaminated food. He prescribed rest and bland diet. Within 3 days, Thomas recovered completely as the hemlock metabolized out of his system. Isaac had conducted a perfect field test. He had poisoned someone under medical supervision, controlled the symptoms, made it appear entirely natural, and demonstrated that he could kill the master's son any time he chose but had elected to let him live. More importantly, he had tested Sarah's nerve. She had executed the poisoning without hesitation, maintained perfect composure throughout Thomas's illness, and understood without being told that this was rehearsal for something larger. That night in the hidden chamber, Isaac met with Sarah, Marcus, and Elizabeth together for the first time. Three people who now knew they were connected in purpose, if not yet in complete understanding. Everything we've learned, Isaac told them, everything we've practiced, has been preparation. Soon, we'll have to leave this place. When we do, others will follow using the routes Marcus has mapped. Information Elizabeth has gathered will help us navigate the legal systems we'll encounter. Skills Sarah has mastered will protect us if we're pursued. He didn't tell them about the deaths that would follow his departure. He didn't explain that his escape was only the beginning of a campaign that would span years and multiple states. He simply said, "When the time comes, trust what I've taught you. Remember that knowledge is power, and power used precisely is revolution." They nodded, understanding that something significant was approaching, even if they didn't know its exact shape. 2 weeks later, Isaac removed his notebooks from their hiding places throughout the plantation. He packed them in the waterproof case he'd constructed. He made final preparations for departure. The network he'd built would continue operating after he left. His students would teach others. The hidden chamber would remain a classroom. The routes Marcus mapped would guide dozens to freedom over the coming years. But Isaac himself had different plans. Plans that required mobility. Plans that required becoming someone other than the enslaved property of a Virginia plantation owner. Plans that required him to transform from teacher into something far more dangerous. The night he left, 7 people walked with him into darkness, following routes they'd memorized, carrying nothing but the knowledge Isaac had given them. They moved through Virginia using the paths Marcus had mapped, avoiding patrols using techniques Isaac had taught, surviving through intelligence rather than luck. 3 months later, Isaac was living in Philadelphia under a new name. Free in the eyes of the law, invisible in a city that contained thousands of free black people. But freedom wasn't his goal. Freedom was simply the platform from which his real work could begin. 6 months after his escape, plantation owners in Virginia started dying. The symptoms were identical. The physicians were baffled. The deaths seemed natural. And in Philadelphia, Isaac read newspaper accounts of these mysterious illnesses with the satisfaction of a teacher seeing his lessons perfectly applied. The network he'd built had continued operating. His students had become teachers. The knowledge he'd shared had multiplied. The revolution wasn't an uprising. It was an infection spreading through the plantation system, invisible and unstoppable, carried by people who had learned that education itself was a form of warfare. And Isaac, sitting in his Philadelphia boarding house reading news from Virginia, understood that he had created something that would outlive him, a system of resistance built not on violence, but on knowledge, not on dramatic gestures, but on patient accumulation of power. They would never catch him. They would never understand what had happened, because they couldn't imagine that their property had been capable of learning, teaching, organizing, executing plans that required years of patience and perfect discipline. Isaac set down the newspaper and opened one of his notebooks. He had 3 more names on his list, 3 plantation owners who had escaped his network's reach but would not escape him. The revolution continued, quietly, methodically, perfectly. Senator Clayton Aldrich of Richmond never suspected that his new valet was a killer. The man who called himself Isaiah Freeman had arrived in late spring of 1858 with impeccable references from a deceased tobacco merchant's estate in North Carolina. The references were forgeries, created by Daniel, Isaac's former student who had become a master of reproducing signatures and official seals. The tobacco merchant had died 6 months earlier, making verification impossible. Aldrich hired Freeman immediately. The senator needed someone who understood tobacco preparation, and this quiet, well-spoken freedman demonstrated expertise that impressed even Aldrich's demanding standards. What Aldrich didn't know was that Isaac had been planning his employment for 18 months. After escaping to Philadelphia, Isaac had spent 3 months establishing his new identity. He rented a room in a boarding house that catered to free black workers. He found employment at a tobacco shop, learning the trade with the same methodical precision he'd applied to everything else. He studied how different tobacco varieties were processed, how cigars were rolled, how flavors were developed through aging and fermentation. But tobacco was simply the vehicle. What Isaac really studied was chemistry applied to organic materials, how heat transformed chemical compounds, how moisture affected alkaloid concentrations, how certain plant extracts could be absorbed through tobacco during processing, then released when smoked, delivering substances directly into a victim's lungs and bloodstream. The notebooks he'd brought from Virginia contained extensive research on alkaloids and their effects on human physiology. Nicotine itself was a poison in concentrated form, but other substances could be even more effective. Belladonna extract, for instance, when properly diluted and applied to tobacco leaves during the drying process, would concentrate as the leaves dried, creating cigars that delivered a lethal dose when smoked. The beauty of this method was its perfect invisibility. Cigars smoked identically whether they contained only tobacco or additional compounds. The bitter taste of many alkaloids was masked by tobacco's own strong flavor, and symptoms appeared gradually during or after smoking, making them seem like natural responses to celebration or stress rather than deliberate poisoning. Isaac spent 6 months perfecting his technique using laboratory rats as test subjects. He would expose them to tobacco smoke treated with various compounds, carefully documenting symptoms, time to death, observable signs of distress. Some alkaloids worked too quickly, killing rats within minutes in ways that would obviously indicate poisoning in humans. Others worked too slowly or unreliably. Isaac needed something that would cause symptoms resembling heart attack or stroke, something that could be attributed to the victim's own weak constitution rather than external intervention. He found his answer in a combination of compounds extracted from oleander leaves and foxglove flowers. When properly prepared and applied to premium tobacco, they created cigars that produced symptoms identical to cardiac failure: irregular heartbeat, chest pain, difficulty breathing, collapse, death within 30 minutes to 2 hours depending on the victim's constitution and how much they smoked. And because these compounds occurred naturally in plants commonly used in ornamental gardens throughout the South, their presence in a victim's body, if anyone even thought to test for them, which was unlikely, could be explained as accidental environmental exposure. Once Isaac perfected his method, he began selecting targets. The list in his final notebook contained 20 names: plantation owners who had purchased slaves from his former master, businessmen who had profited from the slave trade, politicians who had voted for stricter fugitive slave laws, men whose names Isaac had recorded years earlier while serving in his master's library, listening to conversations, reading correspondence, documenting the network of people who sustained and profited from the system that had enslaved him. 17 of those names were men Isaac's network in Virginia could reach. They would die mysteriously over the coming years, as his former students applied the knowledge he'd taught them. The remaining 3 names required Isaac's personal attention because they lived outside Virginia, in cities where his network didn't operate. Senator Clayton Aldrich was the second name on that shorter list. Aldrich was 63 years old, overweight, with a fondness for expensive Cuban cigars and French brandy. He had sponsored legislation that extended the Fugitive Slave Act's reach, making it easier for slave catchers to operate in northern states. He owned no slaves himself. He was too politically savvy for that. But he profited enormously from investments in shipping companies that transported enslaved people between markets. Isaac studied Aldrich for months before approaching him. He read every speech the senator had given, obtained through newspaper archives in Philadelphia's public library. He learned Aldrich's schedule, his habits, his preferences. The senator traveled regularly between Richmond and his country estate, a large property outside the city where he entertained business associates and political allies. Most importantly, Isaac learned that Aldrich had recently dismissed his personal valet after discovering the man had been stealing small amounts of money. The senator needed a replacement, someone trustworthy and skilled in the specialized tasks of maintaining a wealthy man's wardrobe and personal effects. Isaac created Isaiah Freeman specifically for this role, a fictional freedman with a fictional background that would appeal to Aldrich's prejudices. Freeman was quiet, deferential, impeccably dressed, and demonstrated skills that made him valuable. He could press clothing to perfection. He could prepare hot shaving water at precisely the right temperature. He could maintain leather goods, polish silver, and most importantly, he understood tobacco. The interview took place in Aldrich's Richmond townhouse. Isaac, now Freeman, stood in the senator's study wearing clothing he'd carefully selected to project competence without presumption. Conservative black suit, white shirt with modest collar, everything clean, pressed, unremarkable except for its quality of maintenance. Aldrich barely looked at him. "You understand tobacco preparation?" "Yes, sir. I worked for the Thornton estate in North Carolina for 7 years. Mr. Thornton was particular about his cigars. I learned to store them properly, maintain humidity, identify quality by appearance, and draw resistance." "Thornton's dead," Aldrich said, not as question but as verification that he'd checked the reference. "Yes, sir. 6 months passed. His estate was dissolved. I sought employment elsewhere." Aldrich nodded, still not meeting Isaac's eyes. "I require absolute discretion. I entertain business associates who discuss sensitive matters. You'll hear things. You'll repeat nothing." "Of course, sir." "You'll maintain my personal quarters, prepare my clothing, handle correspondence that requires posting, and assist during social functions. The position includes room and board. Salary is $15 monthly." $15 was generous for a valet, even a skilled one. Aldrich was buying loyalty along with service. "That's acceptable, sir. You start Monday. Present yourself at 7 in the morning." The interview lasted less than 5 minutes. Aldrich never asked about Isaac's background beyond the fabricated reference. He never questioned why a freedman of obvious intelligence and capability would accept a servant's position. He simply saw what he expected to see: another black man grateful for employment from a white benefactor. Isaac began work the following Monday. His duties were exactly as described. He maintained Aldrich's extensive wardrobe, prepared the senator's study for morning work, handled routine correspondence, and assisted during the evening social gatherings Aldrich hosted at his country estate. And he prepared the senator's cigars. Aldrich's collection included dozens of varieties from different regions and manufacturers. He kept them in a dedicated humidor room off his study, a climate-controlled space where temperature and moisture were carefully regulated to preserve the tobacco's qualities. Isaac was given complete responsibility for this room. He rotated stock, monitored humidity levels, and prepared cigars for Aldrich's daily consumption. The work gave Isaac everything he needed: complete access to Aldrich's cigars, unlimited time alone in the humidor, no oversight because maintaining cigars was specialized work that Aldrich didn't understand well enough to supervise. Isaac waited 3 months before acting. 3 months of perfect service, establishing patterns, demonstrating reliability, becoming part of Aldrich's routine so completely that the senator barely noticed his presence. 3 months of studying which cigars Aldrich preferred, which boxes he drew from most frequently, which varieties he saved for special occasions. In late August, Aldrich announced he would be hosting a celebration at his country estate. He had won re-election in a campaign that had focused heavily on preventing abolition and strengthening fugitive slave laws. 20 guests would attend, all wealthy men who shared Aldrich's political views and profited from slavery's continuation. Isaac understood this was the moment. Aldrich would be in an expansive mood, celebrating victory, smoking and drinking heavily with friends who encouraged excess. If he died during such a celebration, it would seem natural. The obvious explanation would be overindulgence, the stress of a hard-fought campaign finally taking its toll on a man whose constitution couldn't sustain the abuse he'd inflicted on it. 1 week before the celebration, Isaac prepared Aldrich's cigars. He selected a box of premium Cubans that Aldrich had been saving specifically for this event. 20 cigars in a cedar box lined with silk. Isaac removed them carefully, brought them to his private quarters, and spent 12 hours treating them with compound he'd prepared weeks earlier. The process required absolute precision. Too much compound and the cigars would taste wrong, possibly burning unevenly or producing visible signs of contamination. Too little, and they might not be lethal. Isaac calculated dosages based on Aldrich's body weight, average number of cigars the senator typically smoked during celebrations, and the fact that he would likely consume substantial alcohol, which would accelerate the compound's absorption into his bloodstream. He prepared the solution by extracting alkaloids from oleander leaves and foxglove flowers using alcohol as solvent, then concentrating the solution through careful evaporation until it reached the exact potency he'd determined through months of rat experiments. He applied it to the cigars by carefully opening the box, treating each cigar with precisely measured amounts using a fine brush, then allowing them to dry completely before returning them to the box. The treated cigars looked, felt, and smelled identical to untreated tobacco. Isaac had tested his method enough times to be certain. He returned the box to Aldrich's humidor, placing it exactly where the senator expected to find his celebration cigars. Then Isaac waited. The celebration took place on the first Saturday of September. Isaac assisted with preparations, ensuring everything met Aldrich's exacting standards. Guest quarters were prepared, food was arranged, the senator's formal clothing was laid out, and in the smoking room, Aldrich's special cigars waited in their cedar box. The guests began arriving in late afternoon: wealthy plantation owners, shipping magnates, political allies who had supported Aldrich's campaign with money and influence. They gathered in the main parlor, congratulating the senator, toasting his victory with expensive brandy. Isaac moved through the gathering like a shadow, refilling glasses, clearing used items, invisible and essential. He watched Aldrich drink heavily, his face flushed with triumph and alcohol. The senator was in rare form, expansive and boastful, describing how he had crushed his abolitionist opponent, how he would continue blocking anti-slavery legislation, how the South's way of life would endure despite Northern pressure. As evening approached, the men retired to the smoking room. Aldrich opened the cedar box containing his special cigars, offering them to his guests with visible pride. Cuban, aged 5 years, been saving these for the right occasion. Isaac stood near the door, ready to refresh drinks or fetch anything required. He watched Aldrich light one of the treated cigars, saw him draw deeply, exhale with satisfaction. The senator smiled. "Gentlemen, to victory." His guests echoed the toast. 7 of them accepted Aldrich's special cigars. The others brought their own or declined tobacco in favor of continued drinking. Isaac watched with perfect stillness as the men smoked and celebrated. The compound would take at least 30 minutes to produce symptoms, possibly longer depending on individual metabolism. He needed to remain present, playing his role, until the inevitable occurred. Aldrich finished his first cigar and immediately lit a second. "Can't resist. These are exceptional." One of his guests laughed. "Careful, Clayton. Your physician warned about overdoing it." "My physician is a worrymonger. I'm celebrating properly." The men continued smoking and drinking. Isaac refilled brandy glasses, cleared ashtrays, maintained the room's comfort while internally counting minutes. 43 minutes after Aldrich lit his first cigar, the senator's expression changed. He touched his chest, his face suddenly pale. "Clayton?" one of his guests noticed. "You all right?" "I'm fine. Just..." Aldrich's hand went to his throat. His breathing had become labored, audible. Isaac moved forward with practiced concern. "Sir, should I fetch the doctor?" Aldrich tried to wave him off, but the gesture was weak, uncoordinated. "I just need air." He stood, wobbled, collapsed back into his chair. His cigar fell from his fingers onto the carpet. Isaac immediately retrieved it, stamped it out, all while maintaining an expression of growing alarm that matched the reactions of Aldrich's guests. "Someone get the physician," one of the men shouted. "Sir, let me help you lie down." Isaac put a hand under Aldrich's arm, supporting him as the senator gasped for breath. Aldrich's eyes were wide, panicked. His skin had gone gray. Sweat poured down his face. Classic symptoms of cardiac arrest, exactly as Isaac had observed in his test subjects. The estate's physician arrived within 10 minutes, summoned from guest quarters where he'd been staying during the celebration. He examined Aldrich quickly, checked his pulse, listened to his labored breathing. "Heart attack," the physician concluded. "Someone help me get him to his bed." 4 men carried Aldrich upstairs. Isaac followed, playing the role of concerned servant, fetching water when requested, bringing towels, standing ready to assist however needed. The physician worked frantically, but there was nothing he could do. The compound Isaac had prepared was doing exactly what 18 months of research and testing had designed it to do. Aldrich's heartbeat grew more irregular. his breathing more desperate. His hands clutched at his chest as if he could physically hold his failing heart together. At 10:47 p.m., Senator Clayton Aldrich died surrounded by confused guests and a physician who could do nothing except record the time and cause of death. Heart failure brought on by excessive celebration. The physician noted the empty brandy bottles, the cigars, the stress of a hard-fought campaign. Natural causes for a man who had always pushed his constitution too hard. No one suspected poison. Why would they? Aldrich had died among friends, celebrating victory, indulging in pleasures he'd enjoyed for decades. His physician had warned him repeatedly about his heart. This was tragic, but not mysterious. Isaac maintained perfect composure throughout. He helped prepare the senator's body. He assisted guests who stayed overnight, too shaken to travel in darkness. He answered questions from the physician about Aldrich's recent health, reporting honestly about the senator's heavy drinking and late nights. The following morning, as guests began departing, Isaac packed his own belongings. His employment had ended with Aldrich's death. The senator's estate would be settled by lawyers, the household dissolved, servants released. He had worked for Clayton Aldrich for exactly 5 months and 11 days. No one questioned his departure. He was simply another freedman seeking new employment now that his position had ended. He collected his final salary from the estate manager, expressed appropriate condolences about the senator's death, and left. Isaac returned to Philadelphia. He resumed his work at the tobacco shop, living quietly in his boarding house, reading newspapers for accounts of Aldrich's death. The obituaries were extensive. Aldrich had been an important political figure. His death was mourned by colleagues who praised his dedication to Southern values and his tireless work defending plantation owners' rights. No one mentioned that he had died from anything except natural causes. No one ever suspected that their celebration cigars had been carefully poisoned by a man whose intelligence they would never recognize, whose capacity for patient revenge they couldn't imagine. Isaac crossed Aldrich's name off his list. 2 names remained. The revolution continued. Methodical, invisible, perfect. And somewhere in Virginia, Isaac's network continued operating, teaching new students, preparing more people to resist a system that insisted they were incapable of resistance. Knowledge had become a weapon, and that weapon was multiplying beyond anyone's ability to stop it.